We could throw all the logic for setting up the album list controller in the controller itself, but as always, we're going to create a couple small objects that just do a few things to minimize the surface area for coupling. Writing code this way seems like overkill, but trust me, when you come back in the future to change some functionality, reuse this controller elsewhere, or just change your flow altogether, having all the logic in one class will make your life a nightmare. So let's navigate to the album list controller, and up at the top, we're going to add a stored property to hold on to the artist. Now your alarm bells should be going off because I used a force unwrap operator here. But this is one of those cases where I think crashing would be appropriate. We don't want to load this table view without valid artists or album data. At this point, we already have an artist too, so we know that it's not going to be nil. But the fact that we can't use an initializer here prevents us from making this a non-optional property. In View.load now, we can set the title of this table view controller to the artist's name. So self.title equal artist.name. Okay, so what about album data? Now that's going to take a bit of work. So in the data sources group, let's add a new file. Again, this is going to be a CocoaTouch class, a subclass of NSObject, and we'll call this album list data source. When we created the search results data source, we gave it a data property that we initialized to an empty array to reflect the fact that when we start searching, the table view is displayed with no results. Since we have to select an artist to get to this album page, we can't initialize the album list data source without any data. So keep that in mind. Let's add a private property to hang on to this album data along with an initializer. So private let albums, this is type album, or array of albums, and then we'll initialize the class with an array of albums as well. So self.albums equal albums, and then, since this is a subclass of NSObject, we need to call superinit. Since this object is going to act as the data source, we also need to add protocol conformance, so UI table view data source. And as always, we'll mark off this section. So data source. And both number of sections and number of rows is relatively straightforward. So for number of sections, we'll return 1. For number of rows, we'll return albums.count. As always, the most interesting stuff happens in cell for row. First, we're going to need to dequeue a reusable cell to use and cast it to an album cell. We don't need to stringly type out the reuse identifier here because remember, we added that to the subclass as a static property. So let album cell equal table view.dequeue reusable cell with identifier, and we'll say album cell dot reuse identifier. Now we also need to cast this to the right cell type, so we'll say album cell. Let's go ahead and return the cell for now. We could configure the cell here in this method, but that logic belongs in the cell itself, in my humble opinion. We could also configure the cell directly with an album, but everything in the cell is a text label that requires a string, and we'd need to do some work to get certain values from the types they're stored as to string representations. Oops, I need to change this. So return album cell. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a view model for this. So I'm going to put this in a new group, view models. Now we'll call this, we'll just make it an empty Swift file, and we'll call this album cell view model. This will be a one-way object, so it doesn't model any state, it just accepts data and formats it into the desired format and then outputs it. So let's create a simple struct to handle this, album cell view model. The album cell displays artwork, a title, release date, and a genre. But our view model is only going to provide data for the title, release date, and genre. I'll get into why we're omitting the artwork from this struct in just a second. So let title, string, let release date, string, and let genre, string. In an extension of this type, let's add an initializer to set up a struct from the model, so from an album. I always add my struct initializers in extensions so that they don't override the default member-wise initializer. This way, if I want to quickly test that the cell is working for some different set of data, let's say I don't have an album, I can just pass in the values directly using the default init method. Then here we'll say init from album. And the first and the last property are easy, so we'll say self.title, and we'll use the album's censored name here. For the genre, we did all the work basically when we copy-pasted that type over, so we'll just say album.primarygenre.name. For the release date, we need to format it properly. Right now, it's just a date object. So first, let's create an instance of date formatter, and then let's set the formatter's locale to the user's current locale, which we get by saying locale.current. This way, you'll get the date format in whatever language you have your phone set to. Next, we need to set the desired output date format. So we'll say formatter.dateformat equal MMM uppercase, DD lowercase, comma, and then Y, all lowercase. So the three uppercase M's here refer to the shorthand name of the month, like Jan for January. DD in lowercase gives a numerical representation of the day with a 0 padding for values less than 10. Finally, YYYY is a 4-digit year representation. Check the notes for a reference to see how I arrived at these different values. Now we can just use this formatter to say self.releaseDate equal formatter.string from date album.releaseDate. Okay, so now we have a view model that takes an album and returns either string representations directly from the album or converted over, as in the case of the date. In the album cell class now, let's add a helper method that accepts an instance of a view model and then configures the cell. So we'll say func configure with view model, and this is of type album cell view model. And in here, pretty simple. So we'll say album title label.text equal view model.title, genre label.text equal view model.genre, and then release date label.text equal view model.release date. Now we have all our helper methods. So back in album list data source, after we get the cell, we can get a instance of the model. We'll get an album out of the data source. So let album equal albums, and then we'll use the index path.row to get at the right value. We'll then create a view model using this album. So album cell view model that takes an album. And then we'll use this view model to configure the cell. So album cell dot configure with view model. Let's do one more thing here. Let's also set the album cell to have a disclosure indicator as its accessory view. So album cell dot accessory type equal dot disclosure indicator. Now that should be all the configuration work we need to do. Let me touch on one thing though. The reason we're going to omit the artwork image view from the view model is because when our table view loads, we don't have an image yet. Remember, the artwork URL is stored as a URL. So we're going to start out by just loading that placeholder image view, which we have up by default. After that, when we get to the networking bit, we'll talk about how we can fire off subsequent requests that allow us to get the images in the background without affecting the main flow. In the next video, let's hook all this up so that we can display our fake data.